All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring something that sounds super basic at first glance, but
Ah,
it gets really complicated the more you think about it.
yeah,
And it's this whole idea of like obligations to oneself.
yeah,
Like we tell ourselves we should do things all the time,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
I should eat better, I should exercise more, I should finally finish that project I've been putting off.
Mhm.
But does that should have the same kind of weight as like an obligation I have to another person? Like I owe it to my friend to pick them up from the airport because I promised.
Uh,
Or, like I have to pay my taxes because, well, the government says so.
yeah.
So that's what we're going to try and unpack today. Do we really owe things to ourselves in the same way we owe things to other people?
That's like the central question, right? And I think, if you're someone who's really interested in understanding these sort of naughty philosophical problems, but you don't want to get bogged down in jargon,
Right.
this is a really like perfect example of a problem that even though it sounds kind of simple, it actually is super complicated.
Yeah.
And it has all these implications for how we live our lives.
Absolutely. And we've got a ton of great material to dive into today, including this really in-depth entry on obligations to oneself from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, that's a great resource.
So our mission today, I think, is to kind of try and dissect what we might call the paradox at the heart of this idea of obligations to oneself.
It is kind of like a paradox.
Because the basic problem is that if I owe something to myself, can't I just decide not to owe it anymore?
Right.
Like, can't I just waive the obligation?
Right.
If I'm both the one who owes and the one who's owed, it seems like the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Right. So that's the core issue here. And it's something that philosophers have been like really grappling with for
And
centuries.
and as our sources point out, this paradox actually kind of led to a period where philosophers, particularly like in the 20th century, kind of avoided talking about obligations to oneself.
Mhm.
Like they were so stumped by this paradox that they just kind of said, well, maybe we just don't owe anything to ourselves at all.
They didn't know what to do with it, basically. Yeah, it's easier just to ignore it.
Right. But
Yeah,
I think the really cool thing is that in more recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in this topic.
there has.
Philosophers are starting to take this paradox seriously again, and they're finding all sorts of interesting ways to apply these ideas to different areas of ethics.
Right.
So before we get into how they're trying to solve this paradox, I think we need to kind of take a step back and just ask, like, what are these obligations to oneself supposed to be in the first place?
Yeah, let's start with that.
What kinds of things fall under this umbrella?
Okay. So traditionally, these obligations to oneself have been kind of divided into two main categories: self-care and self-respect.
Okay, those are familiar terms.
Yeah. I mean, self-care, I think, is pretty intuitive. It's basically the idea that we have an obligation to look after our own interests, to promote our own well-being.
Right, like eat healthy, get
Yeah.
enough sleep, all that good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Pursue our goals, take care of our mental and physical health, try to live a fulfilling life, that sort of thing.
Right, the stuff you see on like self-help book covers.
Yeah, exactly.
Take care of yourself, be your best self, all that.
Mm-hmm. But then you have this other category, this idea of self-respect, which is a little bit more tricky. It's not so much about what's directly good for us in terms of like our happiness or our well-being. It's more about maintaining our dignity and acting in a way that's considered morally proper or fitting.
Right.
And so the sources actually give some really interesting examples here, like the long-standing debates about things like consensual sex work or the morality of even a painless suicide when someone's facing like a really prolonged and agonizing terminal
Right,
illness.
really tough cases to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because you can see how self-care and self-respect can sometimes come into conflict.
Right, totally. Like
Yeah.
in those examples you just gave, disrespecting oneself in a certain way might actually be seen as the best path towards self-care
Yeah.
under those specific circumstances.
Exactly.
It's kind of a messed up situation.
Right.
Like ending your own life to escape suffering could be seen as a way of taking care of yourself, even if it means violating some sense of self-respect.
Right. And, this tension actually leads a lot of philosophers to say that, they think one of these types of duty to oneself is really important, but the other one is just like totally mistaken.
Right. It makes sense. Like if you're really focused on promoting well-being, like, if you're a utilitarian, for example,
Yeah.
you might be really gung-ho about self-care, but
Yeah.
you might just be like, what? self-respect. Who cares?
Exactly. Why would you worry about some abstract notion of dignity if it means you're going to suffer more?
Right, totally. So this really highlights a key distinction that I think is super important for us to keep in mind throughout this whole conversation. And that's the difference between obligations to oneself and obligations that merely regard oneself.
Mm-hmm. That is an important distinction.
And these are not the same thing.
No, they're not the same thing at all.
So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so the sources give this great example, which is, imagine that you promise your friend that you'll stop wearing those those really flashy hats.
The ones with all the feathers.
Yeah, the ones with all the feathers.
Okay.
Right? And so as a result of making that promise, you now owe it to your friend to, improve your hat game.
Right.
But that obligation, even though it was directed at your friend, it clearly regards you because you're the one who has to change.
Right. I'm the one stuck with bad hats.
You're the one with the bad hats, yeah. So in that case, the obligation is to your friend, but it's about you.
Got it. So an obligation to someone implies a direct relationship, like I'm owing something directly to that person.
Yeah.
But a self-regarding obligation is about actions that affect myself. Even if the obligation itself isn't actually to myself,
Exactly.
it's about me, but it might not be to me.
Mm-hmm. And I think this leads to this tricky question of what actually makes something an obligation to someone.
Okay, so we're going even deeper now.
Yeah. And so philosophers, they've got different ideas about this. Some of them focus on what's good for the person. They call these interest theories of obligation. And they say that you have an obligation to someone if doing that thing would be good for them.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah. But in the context of obligations to oneself, I think there's another set of theories that are maybe more relevant.
Okay.
And those are what are called standing theories of obligation.
Standing theories.
Yeah. And these theories, they focus on this idea that an obligation to someone gives them a kind of control over the situation.
Yeah.
So, they have the right to demand that you do whatever you owe them. They have a right to say in the matter. And they even have the power to waive the obligation if they want to.
Right, like forgiving a debt.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if we apply this to ourselves, to the idea of obligations to ourselves, it would mean that if we have a duty to ourselves, we must also have rights against ourselves.
Okay, that sounds kind of strange.
It does, right?
Like the right to demand things from myself and the right to let myself off the hook.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why it's so much more controversial to talk about obligations to oneself as opposed to self-regarding obligations.
Right, because to oneself adds that extra layer of weirdness.
Right, it does. And
Yeah.
so as a result of this, a lot of philosophers have tried to kind of reinterpret traditional ideas about obligations to oneself in a way that avoids this paradox.
Okay, so they're trying to work around it.
Yeah.
Instead of just head on, we owe things to ourselves, full stop.
Right. And so, for example, Aristotle, he famously argued that suicide isn't actually an injustice to oneself.
Okay.
He thought it was an injustice to the state because the individual is supposed to serve the state.
Okay, so it's shifting the obligation from the self to something external.
Exactly. And you see similar moves with other things, like taking care of yourself. Some people might say that's not really something you owe to yourself. It's more like a general necessity or maybe even a duty you have to others, like your family who depend on you.
Makes sense.
Or developing your talent. Some people might say, well, that's not just for you. It's also so that you can contribute to society.
Right, so it's kind of sidestepping the to oneself problem by framing it as either a duty to others or just a general, obligation to do good without a specific recipient.
Exactly. And then there's some other approaches too, like some people argue that, well, maybe obligations to oneself just don't come with this power of self-release.
Okay, interesting. So they're taking the paradox head on instead of trying to dance around it.
Right. And so they might say that, well, maybe obligations to oneself aren't really like the strict legalistic obligations that we have in contracts or in law.
Okay.
Those are what philosophers would call juridical duties.
Juridical duties. Okay.
Yeah. And so they might say that obligations to oneself are more like, I don't know, a kind of internal moral requirement.
Right. More like a guideline than an actual rule.
Yeah, more like a guideline.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're owed to our future selves.
Okay.
Or maybe one part of our mind has obligations to another part of our mind.
Right. So it's like, I can't owe something to the current me because current me can just ignore it.
Yeah.
But maybe I can owe something to future me because that's a different entity.
Right. Right. So you can see how this paradox has really forced philosophers to get very creative.
It has.
It's made them rethink the very idea of obligation and what it means to be a self.
Totally. Okay, so we've gotten a sense of what these obligations are supposed to be,
Yeah.
and we've seen the big stumbling block, which is this paradox of self-release.
Yeah.
Now, let's dig a little deeper into that paradox itself.
Right. Let's break it down.
The source mentions this idea of the asymmetry of possibilities. Like, there's some wrongs that you just can't do to yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Like you can't steal from yourself.
Right. Like if I take money out of my right pocket and put it in my left pocket, that's not theft.
Right. Or you can't lie to yourself.
Right. You can't deceive yourself because you already know the truth.
Exactly. So there's this kind of built-in asymmetry when it comes to wronging yourself versus wronging someone else.
Right. There are just some things that are logically impossible to do to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Which might make you think that maybe obligations to oneself are a different beast altogether.
It might, but this doesn't eliminate all possibilities of self-wronging, right?
No, it doesn't. I mean, you can still hurt yourself physically or damage your own property or, squander your talents.
Right. All those self-destructive behaviors.
Yeah. So the question is, are those actions violations of an obligation to oneself? Or is that just a nonsensical way to think about it because of the self-release problem?
Right. Exactly. So it kind of brings us back to the core of the paradox,
Yeah.
which is that obligations are supposed to be binding.
Right.
Like, you're supposed to do them, and if you don't, you've wronged someone.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also supposed to be waivable.
Right.
Like, the person you owe the obligation to can release you from it.
Yeah, totally. And that works fine when we're talking about two different people. Like, if you owe your friend money, they can always just say, hey, don't worry about paying me back.
Right, no problem.
Right. But when you owe something to yourself, that's where it gets tricky.
Right, that's where the whole thing breaks down. Because if I'm the one who can release myself from the obligation, then it doesn't really seem like a real obligation at all.
Right. It becomes like an obligatory hobby.
Right, which is an oxymoron.
Totally.
Yeah.
So this is where Marcus Singer comes in.
Okay, Marcus Singer, famous philosopher.
Yeah. And he's kind of known for formalizing this paradox. He lays it out as a three-premise argument.
All right, give it those premises. Let's see how this logical trap works.
Okay, so premise one, if person A has a duty to person B, then person B has a right against person A.
Okay, that makes sense. Duties and rights go hand in hand.
Yeah. Premise two, if person B has a right against person A, then B can give up that right, which releases A from the obligation.
Okay, we've already talked about that, like waiving a debt.
Right. And then premise three, and this is the kicker, no one can release themselves from an obligation.
Okay, starting to see where this is going.
Right. So if you put those three premises together, it follows that you can't have duties to yourself.
Because if you did, you could just release yourself from them, which is a contradiction.
Exactly. And Singer's conclusion is basically that the whole idea of a duty to oneself is incoherent.
So, big problem for this whole concept.
Right. Major problem.
Now, the source points out that this paradox wasn't entirely new. Like, we actually see hints of it in the writings of some earlier philosophers.
Yeah, and this might surprise you, but even Kant, who's super famous for his emphasis on duty, recognized this tension.
Oh, really? Kant saw this issue.
He did, because he basically said that if the I that imposes the obligation is the same as the I that's obligated, then it creates a kind of weird contradiction, because the I who's imposing could always just release the I who's obligated, and then there wouldn't actually be any binding force.
Right, it'd be like a contract with yourself that you could just tear up whatever you want.
Exactly. And then you have Thomas Hobbes, who talks about this in the context of legal obligations and the sovereign power.
Okay, Hobbes.
Yeah. He's famous for the idea that the sovereign isn't actually bound by laws because they have the power to repeal them, and therefore they're always free. And he extends that to say it's impossible for someone to be bound to themselves because the one who can bind can also release. So being bound only to oneself means not being bound at all. And he has this great line, he is free, that can be free when he will.
Which is very catchy, but also kind of mind-bending when you think about it.
Right.
So, okay, this paradox has a pretty long history. Now, how have philosophers tried to get out of this logical trap?
Yeah, good question. So the source mentions three main approaches, and they really represent different ways of thinking about this problem.
Okay, let's hear them.
Okay, so the first approach is to just accept the paradox, accept Singer's conclusion, and say, okay, fine, there are no literal moral obligations to oneself.
All right, just give up. No
Yeah.
self-obligations.
Yeah. And this is actually the position that Singer himself takes.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And he says that because of this possibility of self-release, a duty to oneself wouldn't be genuinely binding, and that bindingness is essential to what we mean by duty.
Right. If you can just get out of it whenever you want, it's not really a duty.
Exactly. And so he acknowledges that, yeah, we talk about duties to ourselves all the time.
Right, we do.
But he says that language must be metaphorical.
Oh, so it's just figures of speech.
Yeah, basically. Like, when we say someone has a duty to themselves, he thinks what we're really saying is that they have a right to do something. And it would be foolish or imprudent not to do it.
Okay.
Like, you have a duty to yourself to take a break. Really, what we're saying is you have a right to take a break, and you'd be silly not to.
Right, right.
Similarly, promising yourself to do something, he thinks that's just a way of expressing your resolve. But it's not a real promise in the moral sense.
Okay, so it's downgrading the moral weight of all this self-talk.
Yeah, exactly. So for Singer, there are really only two kinds of things going on. There are self-regarding obligations that we owe to other people.
Okay.
And then there are reasons for prudence, things that are in our own self-interest to do. But there's no such thing as a moral duty that we owe to ourselves.
Okay, I see. So it's a clean solution to the paradox, but it does feel kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Like, do we really only have moral obligations to others?
That's a common criticism.
Like, what about that feeling of letting yourself down?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you fail to live up to your own standards.
Right, exactly. And some philosophers, like Anita Allen, actually argue that we should take people literally when they talk about duties to themselves.
Okay, so take it at face value.
Yeah, take it at face value. And that moral theories should actually explain our moral discourse, not just dismiss it as metaphorical when it's inconvenient.
Right. If we all keep saying these things, maybe it's not just a mistake.
Right.
Maybe there's something more to it.
And then there's the question of, like, moral intuitions, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it really just imprudent but not morally wrong to, like, risk serious injury for a cheap thrill?
Or to debase yourself for money.
Yeah,
Like, even if no one else is harmed, those things seem like they have some kind of moral dimension.
right, exactly. And Singer's appeal to metaphor, I think, struggles to explain those intuitions.
Yeah, it does.
And then the source actually brings up another point, which I think is really interesting, which is about rights. So Singer argues that if there were such a thing as duties to oneself, they would imply rights against oneself.
Okay, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we never actually talk about having rights against oneself, do we?
No, we don't. That would be a weird thing to say.
It would.
Like, I have a right against myself not to eat that cake.
Right.
It just doesn't sound right.
No. And so this kind of asymmetry in our discourse is something that Singer's view struggles to explain.
Right. It's like, why do we talk about duties to ourselves but not rights against ourselves? If they're two sides of the same coin, should we use both?
Right. Good question.
Okay, so that's one approach.
Is it?
Denying that there's such a thing as obligations to oneself.
Yeah.
What if there's a second approach?
Okay, so the second approach is to say, no, we do have obligations to ourselves, but they're unwaivable.
Okay. Unwaivable.
Yeah, so you can't just opt out of them. And this is actually a pretty popular approach because it tries to hold on to this idea that we genuinely owe things to ourselves.
Right. It preserves that moral intuition.
Right, and the strategy here is basically to say, okay, maybe Singer's right that duties imply rights, and maybe he's right that rights can be waived. But maybe there's a special class of duties that don't imply waivable rights.
Okay, so a loophole in the paradox.
Exactly, a loophole. And so this would mean challenging either the first or second premise of his argument.
Gotcha. So, like, either saying that a duty doesn't always imply a right, or that not all rights are waivable.
Yeah, exactly. And so some philosophers have tried to make this move. You know, Daniel Kading, he argued for rights without release in certain cases, like promises to the deceased. But even he admitted that this didn't really work very well for obligations to oneself.
Right, because those are a bit different.
Yeah, they are different.
It's not really the same as owing something to yourself.
And then he kind of shifted gears and said, well, maybe we have a benefit sense of obligation to ourselves. So basically that we have a moral obligation to maximize goodness, even if it's just our own goodness.
Okay, so that starts to sound a little bit utilitarian.
Yeah, it does sound a little bit utilitarian, but this line of thinking is actually more commonly associated with Kantian ethics.
Okay, Kant. So we're back to Kant
Back to Kant.
and his famous duties.
Yeah. So for Kant, there's this really important distinction between what he calls juridical duties and non-juridical duties.
Okay, new terms. Juridical versus non-juridical.
Right. So juridical duties are those external enforceable duties, like legal obligations.
Okay, so like you have to pay your taxes.
Yeah, you have to pay your taxes, you have to obey the traffic laws. Those are juridical duties. But non-juridical duties are more internal. They're about our motives and the kind of person we are.
Okay, so it's more about your character, your inner moral compass.
Right, exactly. And importantly, they don't involve powers of release.
Okay, so you can't just waive them.
Right, you can't just waive them. So the Kantian move is basically to say, look, Singer's right, juridical duties to oneself are paradoxical. They don't exist. But we do have these non-juridical duties to ourselves, and those don't have this problematic waivability because they're not, like, legal obligations.
Okay, so they're changing the category of the obligation to make it work.
Exactly. They're saying it's not that kind of duty, it's this other kind of duty.
Okay.
And so for Kant, these non-juridical duties to oneself are things like caring for and valuing ourselves.
Right. Self-love, basically.
Yeah, kind of self-love. And they stem from, like, fundamental aspects of being human,
Okay.
like our capacity for rational choice or our susceptibility to pain.
So you can't just say, I'm going to stop being a rational being for a day.
It can't, right.
Mm.
So for Kant, the key takeaway here is that our obligation to ourselves isn't about external rules that we can break, but about maintaining our inner worth, our dignity, our rationality.
Right. It's about who we are at our core.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a clever way to get around the paradox. But the source does raise a concern, which is if these duties don't come with rights or waivers or any kind of enforcement, are they really duties in the traditional sense?
Yeah, good point.
Like, isn't that what makes a duty, the fact that it's binding, that you can't just ignore it? It seems like they're kind of redefining duty to make their solution work.
Yeah, that is a criticism that's been raised. And it's a valid point, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you don't have any corresponding right and you can't be held accountable for violating the duty, is it really a duty?
Right. It's more like a suggestion or a guideline or a value.
Right. So that's definitely a point of contention. Now, the source also talks about Paul Scofield, who has a really interesting approach to this.
Okay, Paul Scofield.
Yeah.
What's his take?
He's trying to defend the idea of an unwaivable juridical duty to oneself.
Okay, wait. So he's combining those two seemingly incompatible concepts.
Yeah, he is.
Like a duty that is both legally binding and can't be waived. How's that even possible?
Right. So this is where it gets really clever. He argues that we have these duties to our future selves.
Go future selves.
Yeah, future selves.
We're back to that idea again.
Right. So he says that we owe it to our future selves not to harm ourselves in the present or to unnecessarily limit our future choices.
Okay.
And he frames this in terms of legitimate demands. So your future self, looking back on what you did in the present, can demand that you didn't, smoke excessively or waste all your money or whatever.
Right, because those things would harm my future self.
Right. And because you don't yet occupy that future perspective, you can't waive the duty.
Okay, I see. It's like my future self is holding my present self accountable.
Exactly. And my present self can't just say, well, future me, you don't get a say.
Right, it's like I have to answer to a future version of myself.
Mm-hmm. And so this creates a duty that's binding in the juridical sense, but it's also unwaivable from the perspective of the present self.
Very clever.
Right, it's very clever.
But the source does mention some problems with this view. Yeah, it does.
Like, it seems a little adversarial.
Yeah.
Like, my present self and future self are locked in this moral battle.
Yeah, it does kind of paint this picture of a chilly relationship with our future selves.
Right.
Like, we're constantly worried about being sued by our future selves.
Yeah, exactly.
And it also raises this problem of, what about cases where harming yourself in the present might actually lead to a greater benefit in the long run?
Right, like taking a medicine that has side effects but ultimately cures you.
Exactly. So it's not always wrong to do something that might harm your future self. Sometimes it's actually the right thing to do.
Okay, so it's too strict. It doesn't allow for those exceptions.
Right. It's too strict.
Okay, so we've looked at denying obligations to oneself, and we've looked at trying to make them unwaivable.
Yeah.
That leaves us with the third option.
Right. The third option.
Which is to say, no, actually, self-release isn't incoherent. We really can have waivable obligations to ourselves.
Yeah. So this approach is kind of the most direct confrontation with the paradox. Yeah, head on.
Yeah, head on.
So how do they do it? How do they make that work?
Okay, so these theories basically accept that self-release is possible,
Okay.
but they try to show how duties to oneself can still be genuinely binding, even if they're waivable.
Okay, so the challenge is to explain how a waivable duty can still have any teeth.
Right. And I think the core problem is that it seems like if a duty is waivable, you can't really violate it because you can always just waive it at the last minute.
Right, so you're never really bound by it.
Right. It goes back to Hobbes's idea that if you can be free when you will, you're never really bound.
Okay, so how do they address that?
Okay, so one important figure here is G.A. Cohen.
J.A. Cohen. Okay.
And he uses this analogy of a sovereign who makes a law that applies to themselves.
Right.
And he says, even though the sovereign has the power to repeal the law still binds them until they actually repeal it.
Okay.
So the mere ability to be free doesn't mean you are free until you actually take the step to free yourself.
I see. So it's like the obligation is in force until you actively choose to waive it.
Right. And so he's making this distinction between having the power to be free and actually being free.
Okay, so it's not just about the potential